Well, I meant to mention something earlier. When I finish the announcements, I leave. You may have noticed I leave. And when I get up here to preach, Brother Jared leaves. Well, we're not mad at each other, okay? I never thought to mention this. I'm going out to the children's building to tell them a Bible story. And then when Jared finishes, he goes out and helps with the worship. They have video worship out there and everything. So you may have wondered, well, where's he going? He's going out there to help minister to the kids, and then he'll be back here before the invitation time. So anyway, yeah, somebody had asked me about that, and I thought, well, I never thought to mention that, but I guess that's a good question. So anyway, that's what we're doing. So Rod Bannister showed me a picture a moment ago. Somebody in the neighborhood took this picture and put it on the neighborhood Facebook page, for Olson Park area, and there was a goat out here on the porch on the west side of the building. So there he's just standing there in front of the door, this goat. So we don't have any idea. So if you're missing a goat, it was here yesterday, and if it comes back, we're going to sacrifice it. So anyway, I never seen that before. That's a new one. But there's this goat just standing there. So, well, I'm going to start a new series today. I think it'll be really helpful to our community, our church family, our community, dealing with trouble, living in troubled times. And certainly we're doing that, aren't we? So this is going to be a 6-part message about dealing with crisis and discouragement and having faith in moments of adversity, that sort of thing. And so today's message is entitled Dealing with Discouragement, or Handling a Crisis, or something like that. And of course, from time to time, all of us go through difficult times. All of us have to face moments of difficulty or crisis or decision, make major decisions of some kind. And the Bible has a lot to say about this. In fact, Job, of course, was very familiar with discouragement, with problems. In Job 3:26, he said, I cannot relax or be still. He said, I have no rest, for trouble comes. Of course, Job had his cup full of trouble. And then in Job 14:1, he said, man born of woman is of few days and full of trouble. And so for him, it just felt like it was just, all the time, of course, because of all the things that Satan was doing to him. And, of course, you read the book of Job, you understand what that's all about and how the Lord blessed him and delivered him at the end of his ordeal and everything. But anyway, sometimes it just seems like troubles are just coming out of nowhere. And, of course, things have been happening to our country and also around the world these last months that are just inexplicable. No one would have ever thought that we'd be facing some of the problems that we're facing today. The psalmist wrote in Psalm 46:1, God is our refuge and strength, a helper who is always found in time of trouble. And so we need to remember, when we got problems, when we're dealing with trouble, we have a God who loves us and watches over us and provides for us. He's never caught off guard by anything, and He's always there for us. And so we need to remember that. And so continually, as we go through this series, I'm going to continue to remind us that God is there for us, God loves us, God's going to provide for us. We just need to step out on faith and trust in the Lord. Certainly churches are going through a tough time right now, and ours is no exception to that. Many folks are still very, very apprehensive about coming to church, and I understand that. I don't mean to be critical of that. But this is widespread, of course, across the whole country. And, of course, when attendance is down, then giving is down, and then churches get into financial difficulties and stuff like that. So I appreciate so much your faithfulness in coming and giving and supporting the church. I know some are watching right now on our Facebook page, on the Internet, and so I appreciate the fact that you're doing that. You may have heard last Sunday that Grace Community Church in California, where John MacArthur is pastor, decided to go ahead and meet for the first time in months. And that was last Sunday. They had gone for quite a few months not meeting because there is an order in California where churches cannot gather, or at least there's a certain number of people or whatnot. And so they've been adhering to that. They've been respecting that order very much the same way we did, back in March and April when this thing first started up. But then they decided that they were no longer going to do this. They felt like this was becoming an irrational thing. Not coming to church. They said, well, when this thing started up, we were all concerned about how serious this thing may be. And there were projections of 1 million people dying in our country and all of that. And of course, that hasn't happened. And so they said we need to do this to flatten the curve, because the hospitals are getting full, and we want to do everything we can to keep bed space available in the ICUs and all of that. I understand all that. And so they were adhering to these orders out of concern, out of respect for the government, the way the Bible teaches. But they decided a little over a week ago that now things are different. This thing is not nearly as dangerous as once thought. And so they decided, the church elders, that they would begin to meet again. And so John MacArthur had just been preaching to an empty room. They were putting him on Facebook and internet as well, and he was just preaching to an empty sanctuary, and they were filming that and putting it on the social media and all of that. Well, that first Sunday, last Sunday, they have a 3,000-seat auditorium. They meet twice. Both services were packed. 3,000 people showed up for both services. They're not blocking off their aisles. They're not blocking off their rows or anything like that. They said most people are not wearing masks. And so I'm sure there's going to be a lot of talk about this in the news, that they're doing this. But they felt like that this is what they needed to do. They said Christ is king, not Caesar. And so we feel like that this thing is not nearly as dangerous as people thought it would be. Yes, there's some concern. Yes, we should use common sense. Yes, we should take some precautions. But that doesn't mean that this thing is all that terrible, so bad that we can't have faith enough to come and worship the Lord. And so I commend them for that. I think that's a good thing. Do you know that their statistics in California are pretty much the same as Potter and Randall County? And did you know that only 2% of Potter and Randall County have been confirmed to have contracted COVID? Only 2%. And now there's probably others that have it, but the symptoms are so mild they have not even been tested. They don't know they have it, or the symptoms are so mild they don't even bother to get tested with it. And so only 2% have been confirmed to have it in Potter and Randall County. That's 255,000 people. And get this, 99.98% of us will not die with COVID-19. 99.98% of us in Potter and Randall County have not died with COVID-19. I mean, this thing is almost minuscule. And most of those folks that have died had some kind of pre-existing health condition or something like that. So it's good to look at the statistics and to see what's going on and to recognize that, yeah, this is a thing. We need to take some precautions. I'm not ridiculing anybody that does that. But I think there comes a time when we need to step out in faith and say this thing is not nearly as bad and severe as they thought it was going to be. And I'm just going to trust in the Lord to watch over me and take care of me, and I'm going to do what I feel like God would have me to do. And so I urge all of our folks to do that. I urge you to continue to do that. And let's just step out on faith and do what God would have us to do. I think that's the important thing. The statistics are very, very, very close to the seasonal flu, probably even less deaths than the seasonal flu. We never did all this before. We never wore masks or quarantined or locked down for any period of time over the seasonal flu, and yet that's what's going on right now. The reason for that, of course, is because of all the hype and all the media and all of that, and it's become political, of course, to some degree. There are those that want us to stay shut down as a nation, and so those kinds of things are in play, and we need to recognize that this thing turns out to not be nearly as severe as we thought it was going to be. So I'm very thankful for that. And so I'm just encouraging all of our folks to have faith. Pray about what God would have you to do, but we've got to live our lives and serve the Lord, don't we? And just trust in Him to watch over us. And so when we go through a time of crisis, or we go through a time of fear, or there's great discouragement, that's when we need to look to the Lord. That's when we need to step out on faith and be optimistic about what God can do in our church and in our community and in our country and around the world. And so we need to step out on faith and trust the Lord. So how do we overcome discouragement? Well, this morning we're going to look at a familiar passage from the Old Testament, book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah in chapters 1 and 2. And if you remember, Nehemiah was a servant to the king. King Artaxerxes was the Persian king. Persia is present-day Iran. And so Persia at that time was the world power. And Artaxerxes was a very important official for the king. In fact, he was the cupbearer to the king. Now, the cupbearer had the responsibility of tasting the drinks, the wine, and the food before it would be given to the king. That way, if anybody poisoned the food, it would get him first, okay? So it's a pretty big responsibility. But he did more than just that. This is a high-ranking official in the king's court. And so Nehemiah was serving the king about 445 BC, 445 years before the birth of Christ. Now, if you recall, a little background here, about 140 years prior to that, 586 BC, is when the Babylonians came in and destroyed Jerusalem, and they sacked the temple. They took the articles out of the temple. The Ark of the Covenant was not heard from since then. We're not sure if they carted it off or if the priests skirted it away or whatever, if it's hidden somewhere. But the Babylonians came in and destroyed the city of Jerusalem. They tore down the walls. They sacked the city and just completely destroyed it. And they deported a bunch of the Israelis back to Babylon. And so they were in exile, you recall, for 70 years. And then after 70 years, the Persian king Cyrus allowed the Jews to come back and to rebuild their temple. And so that was 70 years later. That was a prophecy that was fulfilled in the Scriptures. And so they came back, some of the Jews came back, and they rebuilt the temple. And then 70 years after that, some 140 years after this invasion of the Babylonians, the walls around the city of Jerusalem were still down. They had not been rebuilt. Even though the temple was there, for 70 years after the temple was completed, they still did not have a wall around the city, the old city of Jerusalem. You say, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, back in those days, if a city did not have a wall around it, it was wide open to its enemies. The enemies could just come in and take it at any time. And it was a disgrace. It was a disgrace if the walls had been torn down, the defensive walls had been torn around this city, torn down. That indicated that that city was no longer powerful, it was no longer prestigious, and the people were in great, great danger. And so it was a devastating thing for a city to not have a defense around it, to not have walls around it. And so that's where we pick up this story of Nehemiah. He has some friends, and one of them may have been actually a blood relative of his, a brother of his, that had gone to Jerusalem, and they came back, and they're giving a report of what they had seen. And so he's asking them about that. We pick that up here in Nehemiah chapter 1 in verses 2 and 3, and that's where we see that he exposes the problems that he's going to have to deal with. All right? He exposes the problems of the city being sacked and the walls still being torn down and all of that. And that really is the first step that you have to take to dealing with a crisis. You examine the problem, you evaluate the problem, you analyze it so that you'll fully understand exactly what's going on. So in Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 2, he says, I asked them about the Jews who had escaped from being captives in Babylonia. Some of them had gone back, to rebuild the city and everything. He said, I also asked them about the city of Jerusalem. And they told me the captives who have come back are having all kinds of troubles. They're terribly disgraced. Jerusalem's walls are down, and its gates have been burned. And so they tell him, hey, the city's in terrible, terrible shape. There's great discouragement because there is no wall around the city. Now, back at that time, I found a diagram of the old city of Jerusalem back during the time of Nehemiah. And this wall went up around the temple, where the temple used to be, up on the Temple Mount today, and came all the way down to the city of David, all the way down to the pool of Siloam. If you ever looked on a map, you can see this. It kind of looks like a tadpole or something, is kind of how it looked like back then. And I did a little research on this and found out that this wall around the city at that time was 1 3/4 miles long, 1.7 miles long. Now, to give you a little perspective, that's from our church house right where you're sitting all the way to Georgia Street, okay? It's about 3/4 of a mile from here to Western, and then from Western to Georgia, it's a mile. So all the way from the church house to Georgia Street. That's how long this wall was, okay? You say, well, how big was it? Well, they've found some of the wall. They've excavated some of the wall in the city of David, and the estimates are that it averaged about 15 feet wide. Now, that's the width of a 2-car garage door, okay? You have a 2-car garage, it's about the width of that door, 15 feet wide, and the wall was probably about 30 feet tall. 30 feet is the highest point in our sanctuary. Right up there at the top, I've been up there, I know, it's 30 feet, okay? Because we've changed light bulbs. So that's how tall that wall was, It was wide as a double-car garage door, and it was 1 3/4 miles long. Okay? It had 9 gates and 2 towers. And all of this had been torn down. And that's what Nehemiah hears about. That the wall around the city of Jerusalem is in ruins, its gates have been burned, there's nothing there, and it's in great, great distress. And so he made up his mind that he was going to do something about that. And the first thing he did was to inquire about the problem. He exposed the problem, he analyzed it, he examined it, and he understood exactly what was going on, that this was a terrible, terrible crisis, and he realized that there's something that had to be done, and somebody had to do something about it. It goes on in the text to say that he began to pray about this, and he began to search his own heart. And what's so amazing about Nehemiah is that he actually took some personal responsibility for this when he prayed, and he said, Lord, this is our fault as a nation. We have brought this upon ourselves because of our disobedience to you. Now, there's no indication that I'm aware of that Nehemiah had ever even been to Jerusalem until he went to fix the wall. Maybe he had, I don't know. But, he's been in exile. I wouldn't think that he would be an old man, but he could have been. But there's no indication that he'd ever even been there before. And yet he knows the history of his country and of the city of God and all of that. And he was devastated by the news that the wall had been destroyed around the city. Now, I want to mention some walls in your life that may be crumbling, okay? We all have walls. We all have problems in our lives that we have to deal with. And it's kind of like the wall around the city falling down. And so, of course, one of those that I've already mentioned is our country. Our country's in pretty bad shape right now, isn't it? I mean, we've got this COVID thing going around that we're dealing with. And there are protests have been, taking place in over 2,000 cities in all 50 states since 2 months ago when George Floyd was killed by that cop, that bad cop that murdered him. And so protests and riots and looting and all of that, of course, has been taking place now for the last couple of months. And we really have, as a nation, I think, lost our moral compass, haven't we? The Bible says, woe unto those who call evil good and good evil, and that's what we see happening today. All these crazy things about calling for the police to be defunded, which is ridiculous, and looting and thieving and killing and all of this kind of stuff that's happening. Lawlessness is taking place. All these cities where there's burnings, and every night, night after night, there are protests that lead into riots and all of that. It's just a terrible, terrible thing. Did you know that Friday night, this past Friday night, Black Lives Matter and Antifa extremists in Portland were burning Bibles and American flags? Did you hear about that? Now tell me why they're doing that. They were burning Bibles and American flags. I'll tell you something. This has nothing to do with protest. There's not anything to protest. This is socialism. This is Marxism. This is just evil. These are people that are just looking for an opportunity to tear down our country. That's all that it is. There's no excuse for this stuff. There is nothing to protest. There hasn't been anything to protest. The bad cop that killed George Floyd is arrested. He's probably going to spend the rest of his life in prison. That's probably where he belongs. Yes, there are some bad cops out there, a few, but 99% of them are great, right? 99% of them do their job, and they protect us, and they serve our community. And they're in positions of authority, and they need to be respected. And so this thing has just gone completely haywire and out of control. And we're seeing the breakdown of our society. And so we're in terrible, terrible trouble as a nation. Our walls are down around our country. And so, this has nothing to do with George Floyd anymore. This is just, socialists, young socialists that are trying to tear down our way of life, destroy our freedoms, and they're trying to find some excuse to do that, and it's just absolutely ridiculous. And so we need to pray that our country will stand firm and that we'll get back to biblical principles and rebuild the wall around our country. Maybe the wall around your marriage has been crumbling. A lot of couples struggle with marriage problems. Certainly no marriage is perfect. Some are doing better than others. But is it true that your marriage is struggling, that things are not as good as they should be? Maybe the walls around your marriage have begun to crumble, and things are just not as good as they ought to be. And so I want to encourage you that God has a solution to that problem as well. You can rebuild that wall around your marriage. Sometimes it's the wall around our family. The family structure is becoming unraveled, and there's a lot of dysfunction in the family, or there are a lot of problems in the family to be dealt with. And so the wall around your family could be crumbling. Another thing that families deal with oftentimes is finances. Maybe your financial situation is not very good, especially during these days when so many people are out of work and so many people are seeing their businesses shut down and all of that. And so a lot of folks are really struggling financially and are unable to have the income that they need to provide for themselves and for their families. Maybe your health is bad. Maybe the wall around your health is not as good as it should be. And so you're struggling health-wise. You're not as healthy as you would like to be. And then finally, I want to mention your spiritual life. Maybe your spiritual life is not what it should be before the Lord. And that wall around your spiritual life is not strong. It's not upright. It's beginning to fall down and to crumble. And the devil is moving in on you and trying to defeat you and discourage you in your walk with the Lord. It's sad that not all Christians are faithful followers of the Lord, not as faithful as they should be. And sometimes we all struggle with that. Sometimes we all have a difficult time trying to be as faithful to the Lord as we know we should be. And so it could be that your walls are down in some way or another in one of these areas, maybe several of these areas. I know for our church and for our country that we're struggling right now, and we need to rebuild that wall around our Jerusalem. And so that's what Nehemiah decided he was going to do. He took personal responsibility to do something about this. And the first thing he began to do, of course, was to experience this travesty in his own personal life. He experienced the pain of what was going on. He reflected on this. And again, I don't know that he'd ever even been there before, to Jerusalem. Maybe he had, but he was devastated by this, and he was so distraught about what was happening to his city, his home city, the city of Jerusalem, of his people. And so he began to pray. In Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 4, he says, when he heard this news, he said, I sat down and I cried. And then for several days I mourned. When's the last time you cried and you mourned over something that you felt like was devastating, that, perhaps was not affecting you personally, but something that affected your nation or your church or your family? Now that's personal. But he really internalized these things. He cried, he mourned. He said, and I went without eating. In other words, he fasted to show my sorrow, and he said, I prayed. So he began to fast and to pray. And so fasting back then, of course, was not just going without food for the purpose of losing weight or something like that. It wasn't a diet. It was to show mourning. It was to show devastation in your own life and how you were impacted by some terrible thing that had happened. And so he's praying, he's fasting, he's crying out to the Lord. And some 11 times in this story it mentions that Nehemiah prayed to the Lord. He was a man of great prayer. He cried out to God and asked God to help in this terrible time of need for the nation of Israel. And so emotion, of course, leads to passion. When you're emotional about something, when you're connected to something, when something really means something to you, it devastates you when things are not going well. And so that's the way it should be for our country. Don't you love your country? Boy, I love our country with all my heart. I remember when I was a kid, even in elementary school, I'd be standing out there and the flag would be waving on the flagpole, and I was just a little bitty kid, and it'd just send chills up my back, to see our flag. And we would stand in the classroom and we'd do the Pledge of Allegiance and that sort of thing. That really had an impact on me as a young person, as a child. And I learned to become a patriot. I love our country with all my heart. We have a wonderful country. Amen. We have probably the greatest country on earth, second maybe only to Israel. It's a great, great country. And I'm proud of our country. Certainly we've got mistakes and problems and troubles in our country, and no country is perfect, but we've got a tremendous country. And I love our country with all my heart. I love our church with all my heart. I think this is a wonderful fellowship of believers. And it's been my privilege to serve here. I can't believe it. For 28 years. It's unbelievable. I know most of you can't believe I'm that old. But, I am. And I'm just well preserved. But anyway, it's been one of the greatest highlights of my life to serve in this church family. And I love you guys. I love all of our church members. And, we've been through difficult times and good times and times when things are just blowing and going and times like now when it's not blowing and going at all. And we got to stand together, don't we? We got to stand together. We got to pray. We got to internalize this thing and recognize that we got to take responsibility for this thing. We got to do our part individually and together, corporately, to rebuild the wall around our church and to rebuild the wall around our country. And so that's what we need to do. We need to do exactly what Nehemiah did. He analyzed the problem. He recognized what's going on. He internalized it. He experienced that personally, and he was determined to do something about it. Now, let me mention here a couple of appropriate responses to pain. When you're suffering, when you're troubled about something and something's really bothering you, first thing you should do is don't worry about suppressing your feelings. It's okay to let your emotions out, okay? Sometimes we think that's a silly thing. Sometimes we think it's embarrassing if we show our emotions, especially men. Men seem to be really worried about showing emotions. Well, I think it's a powerful thing to let your emotions show. Just let your feelings express themselves to others. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to be troubled. It's okay to be passionate about that. In fact, it's a good thing to be passionate about something that's really troubling you, really bothering you. You remember when Jesus had been told that his friend Lazarus had died and the sisters sent for him to come, and he knew exactly what was going to happen. But nevertheless, when he got there, it says that all these people were gathered around there where they had buried Lazarus, in the tomb and everything. And there was a lot of crying and weeping going on and all of that. And we know that Jesus loved Lazarus and he loved these sisters. And we're told that when he got there, in John 11, verse 33, it says, when he saw Mary, one of the sisters, when he saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. And it says, Jesus wept. The shortest verse in all the Bible. Jesus wept. That's always amazed me because he knew in just a few moments he was going to bring Lazarus back from the dead. And yet he was just overcome with emotion. He was overcome with passion and feeling because he saw what was going on. These other people were being hurt. They were troubled. They were brokenhearted. Especially these two sisters were just devastated. And he internalized that pain. And he felt their pain. That's kind of a cliche, but he really did feel their pain, didn't he? He really did. And the Bible says that Jesus himself wept when he saw the grieving that was going on at the death of Lazarus. So don't suppress your feelings. Feelings are there for a reason. God created us with emotions. He wants us to have feeling. He wants us to have passion about what's happening in our lives. And that's how we bring about positive change, when we react in a positive way to that passion and that emotion. So don't suppress your feelings. And the second thing is always ask God for help. Always ask God to give you guidance, to give you wisdom, to enlighten you, to strengthen you, to show you the way to go. You should always, when you got a problem, you should always be praying to the Lord, shouldn't you? I mean, as Christians, that should just be a given, that we should do that. When Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, just before he was arrested to be taken to the Sanhedrin and then before Pilate and eventually go to the cross, that night when he was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, the Bible says that he was in agony. He was so afraid. He was so scared. In his humanity, he was scared about what was about to happen to him. Anybody would be, right? And so he was praying there. And it says in Luke 22, verse 41, that he withdrew about a stone's throw beyond his disciples, and he knelt down and he prayed. And then it says an angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. Isn't that amazing? God the Father sent an angel from heaven to come down and to be with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, to comfort him, to put his arm around him, to strengthen him, so that he could go through with what he had to go through with. I like to think that it's almost like someone from home. God sent someone from home to come and to be there and to give him the courage and the strength that he needed to face that cross. And so, always ask God for help. God always responds. When we're sincere and when we're passionate about something, when we're really troubled about something, God knows it's real. God can see that in our hearts. And when we pour out our heart to the Lord and we're seeking God's help, I guarantee you God will never let you down. He will strengthen you. He will give you what you need to deal with what you have to deal with, right? We all know that. We've all been there. And so that's what happened here. Always ask God for help. And so it's important to experience the situation you're dealing with, the crisis that you're dealing with, to understand it, to analyze it. You gotta experience the pain of that thing, experience the grief of it, and then finally you got to explore all the possibilities. What can I do to bring about a positive result? Notice what Nehemiah did here in chapter 2, verse 7. He asked the king. The king could tell that he was depressed. That's amazing. He was just serving the king, and he had this sad look on his face, and he was kind of moping around and everything, and I guess that was very unusual for him. And so the king says, Nehemiah, is there something wrong with you? Is everything okay? Even the queen noticed it. Is everything okay? What's wrong? And so he tells him what's going on. He said, no, I've heard from my friends that went to Jerusalem that the wall around the city has collapsed and the gates are burned with fire and it's in great distress and it's just breaking my heart. And so the king says, well, what do you want to do? What do you want me to do about this? And in verse 7, Nehemiah said, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of the Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe conduct. In other words, would you help me to get there safely? And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, so he'll give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple and for the city wall. Now this is about 4 months after Nehemiah found out about Jerusalem. So he's had 4 months to pray, he's had 4 months to plan, and to figure out what he could do to bring about a positive change. And as soon as the king gave him an opportunity, he said, would you let me go back and do something about it? Would you let me go to Jerusalem and do something about it? Help me to get there safely, and would you provide me with everything I need to rebuild the wall and to rebuild the gates and all of that? And of course, Nehemiah promised that he would come back after that job was finished. And so the king granted him permission to do that, allowed him to go back and to rebuild the wall. He must have been a man of great character, of great integrity for the king to admire him so much to let him go and do something like that. And so the king said, yes, I'll let you go. And so the next little blank there in your outline is when you're trying to figure out what to do about your problem is you need to devise some kind of a plan of action. What am I going to do about this? How am I going to solve this problem? I realize how bad it is. I've analyzed the situation. I'm internalizing this personally. I feel the grief and the pain of the crisis in my life. Now, what am I going to do with God's help and the help of others to turn this situation around and to fix this problem? And that's exactly what he did. He went back to Jerusalem. The Bible says, if you go back and read the story, the first thing he did when he got there is he got on a mule and he just began to ride around the old walls there. And you could see where they're all broken down and collapsed and everything. And everywhere he could go, he just rode around at night. Nobody knew he was doing it. He's just out surveying the damage and all of that to see how bad it is and everything. All this time now, he's been plotting and planning exactly what needs to be done to fix this problem. He's got all the materials that he needs, but he's going to have to rally the troops here. He's going to have to get these people on board in order to rebuild this wall around the city. Again, this wall's 30 feet high, it's 15 feet wide, it's 1.75 miles long. Can you imagine the monumental task that he was facing to rebuild that wall? I'm not sure how many people were there at that time. I tried to find out. I couldn't find out what the population of Jerusalem might have been at that time. I'm sure it would just be an estimate, but there must have been several thousand, I'm sure. But it's going to take a lot of people working together to rebuild this wall, isn't it? I mean, this is a monumental task. And notice what Jeremiah said to the people. In verse 17 of chapter 2, he said to them, you see the trouble that we're in. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. Will no longer be in disgrace. Do you notice he uses the plural there? He says, you see the trouble we are in, not just me, not just you, we're in this thing together. He said, come, let us rebuild the wall around Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. If you're going to face this problem, you can't do it alone, can you? You're going to have to ask others to pitch in and to help you. You're going to have to lean upon the Lord and trust in the Lord to help you to get the job done. And with God's help, all things are possible, aren't they? And so he had a plan of action. Now there's three things you need to examine when you're developing a plan of action. The first one is, where am I right now? Where am I right now? You're in a time of crisis. You're in a time of discouragement. The walls are down in your life. Walls are down around our church right now. The walls are down around our country. Okay, we see the problem we're in. We know what it's all about. That's where we are right now. The second thing is, where do you want to go? Where do you want to be a year from now? Where do you want to be 2 years from now, or 3 years from now, or 5 years from now? And so you need to begin to make plans, and you need to set goals, and to figure out what exactly is it that I need to do. Where do I want to be somewhere down the road so that things will be much, much better, and begin to think about that and to visualize how good things can be instead of how bad things are. And then number 3, you need to figure out how to get there. How am I going to get there? That's when you begin to plan and take action, and you ask other people to pitch in there and help you to rebuild the wall and to get things back to where they need to be. That's pretty basic and pretty simple, isn't it? That's exactly what God would have us to do as a church. We want to build our church back up. We want to strengthen our church family. We want things to be much, much better than they are now. We got to work together, don't we? We got to be faithful. We got to give faithfully. We got to be sacrificial in our service to the Lord and through our church. We got to come regularly and worship the Lord. Pray that God would bless us and continue to increase our numbers and bring more people back to church each and every week. And I really believe with all my heart, in a year or so, we could fill this place up. We really could, couldn't we? We really could. I don't see why we couldn't do that. And so we need to pray about that. We need to work hard together to see that happen. And as bad as things are in our country, I really believe we're going to see our country come out of this thing okay. I really believe that. Now, I'm one of those that believes the Lord may come back anytime, and we could be very, very close to the end times. And so you say, well, things may get worse. That's true, they might. But I really do have faith that if it's not God's timing that He come back right now, things can get much, much better in our country. I really believe that. I have faith that our country can come back from the low point that we're in right now, and we can be back to being that great nation that we once were. I really believe that. And I believe the same thing about you and about your situation and about your family and about the problem you're going through, whatever it is, whichever wall you've got around your life that's being collapsed. I'm convinced that with God's help, all things are possible. And things can be better. Things can look good once again. And so I think we have a great lesson here from Nehemiah about prayer, about faith, about internalizing that problem, about trusting the Lord to help us to overcome the difficulties in our lives, and to really understand that all things really are possible with God. We can see these things happen if we'll just work together. But we got to do it together. Amen? We got to serve together. Well, let's all stand and pray.